In a small Nebraska railroad station, a desperate woman was about to face the cruelest rejection of her life. What started as a hopeful journey to meet her mail-order groom took a shocking turn when she came face to face with public humiliation and abandonment. Margaret O'Sullivan wasn't your typical mail-order bride. For 28 years, she'd spent her life caring for others in Boston, known for her resilience and quiet dignity despite constant criticism about her appearance. When she encountered Walter Grimsby's brutal rejection at the Millfield station, she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would change everything. Thomas Fletcher, a struggling widowed farmer watching from the platform, made an impulsive decision that would lead to the most unexpected marriage proposal in the town's history. What began as a woman's worst nightmare would become a testament to unconventional love. The community of Millfield would never be the same after witnessing how two desperate souls could transform desperation into devotion, proving that sometimes the most broken hearts create the strongest foundations for love. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning train wheezed into Millfield Station with a labored hiss of steam, its black smoke dispersing into the crisp October air like scattered prayers. Thomas Fletcher adjusted his worn hat against the chill and checked his pocket watch. 7:30 sharp, just as the schedule promised. He'd timed his supply run to coincide with the train's arrival, hoping to catch word from his creditor in Omaha. The letter he'd been expecting hadn't come yesterday, and each day without news tightened the knot in his chest a little more. Around the platform, the usual collection of townspeople gathered, some waiting for passengers, others drawn by the simple excitement of the train's arrival in their small Nebraska town. Thomas recognized most faces. Old Pete Henley collecting a shipment for his general store, the widow Morrison hoping for letters from her son in Denver, and near the station house, Walter Grimsby pacing with the nervous energy of a man about to collect something he'd paid for. Thomas knew about Grimsby's mail-order bride. Word traveled fast in Millfield, and the bachelors boasting at Murphy's saloon had been impossible to miss. Young and pretty, Grimsby had declared to anyone who'd listen, waving the photograph that had arrived with her letter. Just what a man needs to make his mark in this territory. The train shuddered to a complete stop, and passengers began emerging from the cars. Thomas watched absently, his mind on wheat prices and overdue payments, when he noticed a woman stepping down from the second car with careful, measured movements. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had seen better days, but was meticulously clean and pressed. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a modest hat, and she carried herself with a dignity that couldn't quite hide her obvious nervousness. Margaret O'Sullivan had traveled 3 days from Boston with nothing but a carpet bag, a trunk, and the fading hope that her photograph hadn't lied too much about her appearance. She'd chosen her best dress for this moment, the one that made her feel least conspicuous about her fuller figure. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts and searched the platform for the man whose letters had promised her a new life. "Miss O'Sullivan." Grimsby's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Margaret turned toward the sound, her face lighting with tentative relief. "Mr. Grimsby, oh, thank goodness. I was beginning to worry." But Grimsby's expression stopped her words cold. His eyes moved over her with the calculating gaze of a man inspecting livestock, and what he saw clearly displeased him. The photograph she'd sent had been taken years ago, before grief and her aunt's constant criticism had added pounds to her frame. She watched his face change, hope curdling into something ugly. "You're not what I ordered," Grimsby announced, his voice carrying across the platform. Several heads turned their way. "That picture you sent, it was a lie, wasn't it?" Margaret's cheeks burned with shame, but she lifted her chin. I'm Margaret O'Sullivan. We've been corresponding for 3 months, Mr. Grimsby. Surely nothing. Grimsby's voice grew louder, drawing more attention. I asked for a wife, not a cow. Look at you. Too fat by half, and probably twice as old as you claimed. Thomas felt his stomach clench as he watched the scene unfold. Around the platform, people had stopped their conversations to stare. Some wore expressions of pity, others barely concealed. Amusement. Mrs. Dorothy Henley whispered something to her companion behind a gloved hand, her eyes bright with the prospect of fresh gossip. Please. Margaret's voice remained steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I've come all this way. I sold everything I owned to pay for the passage. Perhaps if we could just talk. Talk about what? About how you deceived me? Grimsby stepped closer, his voice dripping with contempt. I work hard for my money, Miss O'Sullivan. I won't be cheated by some desperate spinster who thinks she can trap a man with lies. The word spinster hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd heard it whispered behind her back in Boston, seen it in her aunt's disappointed gaze, felt it in the weight of every passing year that brought no suitors to her door. But hearing it spoken so publicly, so cruelly, made her feel as if her skin had been flayed open for all to see. Thomas found himself taking a step forward without conscious thought. Something in the woman's posture, the way she held herself straight despite the humiliation, the dignity she maintained even as her world crumbled, reminded him of another time, another woman facing impossible circumstances. Sarah had looked just so when the doctor had told them about the complications, about the choice between her life and the baby's. Furthermore, Grimsby continued, warming to his theme and clearly enjoying the attention, I'll be writing to that matrimonial agency. They ought to be shut down for trafficking in false goods. I never misrepresented myself, Margaret said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the morning air. I told you I was 28 years old, that I'd been caring for my sick aunt, that I had experience managing a household. All of that was true. What you didn't tell me, Grimsby shot back, was that you'd gotten fat doing it. A few men in the crowd chuckled, and Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. He remembered Sarah's tears when she'd gained weight during her pregnancy, how beautiful she'd remained to him, even as she'd grown self-conscious about her changing body. The casual cruelty of these strangers made his chest tight with anger. Margaret's composure finally cracked. She sank down onto her trunk, her traveling bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Please, she whispered, the word barely audible. I have nowhere else to go. That's not my concern, Grimsby declared. The next train east leaves at 2 o'clock. I suggest you be on it. He turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving Margaret alone on the platform as the crowd began to disperse. The show was over, and people had business to attend to. Soon only a few stragglers remained, stealing glances at the abandoned woman before hurrying about their affairs. Thomas stood frozen, watching as Margaret's shoulders shook with silent sobs. The station master approached her with obvious reluctance, clearly preparing to inform her that she couldn't remain on the platform indefinitely. In a few hours, she'd be forced to choose between a return ticket to a life that no longer existed and what? The streets, a charity house, the fate that awaited unmarried women with no family and no prospects was a grim one. His own troubles seemed suddenly small in comparison. Yes, he might lose the farm. Yes, he struggled every day to be both father and mother to Emma and Samuel. Yes, he went to bed each night aching with loneliness and woke each morning to the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to lessen. But he had a home, a purpose, people who depended on him. This woman had nothing. Margaret lifted her head and wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, gathering herself with visible effort. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. Whatever came next, she would face it with what dignity remained to her. That small act of courage, decided Thomas. He approached slowly, removing his hat as you drew near. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm Thomas Fletcher. I couldn't help but overhear what happened, and I wanted to offer my sympathies." Margaret looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, clearly expecting another curious gawker, or perhaps someone worse. But Thomas's weathered face held only kindness, and his voice carried the gentle tone of a man who understood something about suffering. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Fletcher." Thomas knelt down beside her trunk, bringing himself to her eye level. "Ma'am, I don't know your circumstances, but I can see you're in trouble, and I might have a solution that could help us both." Margaret stared at him, uncertain whether to hope or fear what this stranger might propose. Around them, the platform continued to empty as the morning business concluded, leaving them increasingly alone with whatever words would come next. The morning sun climbed higher, but the chill in the air remained, settling over them both like a promise of the hard choices that lay ahead. Thomas knelt beside Margaret's trunk, his weathered hands resting on his knees as he searched for the right words. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the nearly empty platform, and he could see the station master checking his pocket watch with increasing frequency. "Ma'am," Thomas began again, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I know this might sound forward, but would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee? There's a small cafe in the station house, and you looked like you could use a moment to gather yourself." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of the mockery or pity she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she found only genuine concern in his grey eyes. There was something solid about Thomas Fletcher, something that spoke of a man who'd faced his own share of hardships and emerged with his kindness intact. "Yes, thank you," she said softly. "That would be very kind." Thomas stood and offered his arm, helping her rise from the trunk. "My wagon's right over there. We can bring your things." The station cafe was little more than a counter with a few small tables, but it was warm and private. Thomas settled Margaret at a corner table while he fetched 2 cups of coffee from the proprietor, an elderly German woman who asked no questions but watched the proceedings with curious eyes. "Here," Thomas said, setting the steaming cup before Margaret. "Mrs. Hoffman makes the best coffee between here and Omaha." Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "You're very kind, Mr. Fletcher. More than I deserve after that spectacle." "That man was a fool," Thomas said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. "And cruel besides. You deserved none of what happened out there." Tears threatened again, but Margaret fought them back. "I suppose I was naive to think it would work. My aunt always said I was too trusting, too hopeful about things that weren't meant for someone like me." Thomas sipped his coffee, studying her face. Despite her tears and the morning's humiliation, there was intelligence in her eyes, a quiet strength that hadn't been broken by Grimsby's cruelty. "What brought you all the way from Boston, if you don't mind my asking?" Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Desperation, Mr. Fletcher. Pure and simple desperation." She paused, then seemed to make a decision. "My parents died when I was 16. Yellow fever took them both within a week. I went to live with my aunt and uncle in Boston, my mother's sister. They took me in, but they never let me forget it was charity." She stared into her coffee as the words came easier. "My aunt meant well, I suppose, but she was always disappointed in me, too heavy, too bookish, too set in my ways. When I turned 25 without any serious suitors, she began suggesting I consider alternative arrangements for my future. When I saw the advertisement for the matrimonial agency," she shrugged, "it seemed like a chance for something different, a new start." Thomas nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I have enough money for either a ticket back to Boston or She gestured helplessly. I don't know what the or would be. My uncle made it clear when I left that my room would be rented to someone else. There's nothing for me there. The station master appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat. Excuse me, folks, but the lady's trunk can't stay on the platform much longer. Next train comes through in a few hours. Thomas held up a hand. We'll move it shortly. Thank you. When the man left, Thomas leaned forward. Miss O'Sullivan, I want to tell you something about my situation. I think you deserve to know why I approached you. Margaret looked up, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. I'm a widower, Thomas continued. Lost my wife Sarah 2 years ago to complications in childbirth. She was everything to me. I've got 2 children. Emma's 6 and Samuel just turned 4. I'm trying to keep our farm going, but it's been harder than I expected. Not just the work, though that's plenty difficult for one man. It's the loneliness, Miss O'Sullivan. It's going to bed every night knowing that tomorrow will be just as hard and empty as today. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. This man wasn't offering pity. He was sharing pain. I've been thinking lately that maybe I should consider remarrying. Not for love, you understand. I don't think I could love anyone the way I loved Sarah, but for companionship, for help with the children and the farm, for someone to share the burden with. Thomas paused, running his hand through his brown hair. When I saw what happened to you out there, I saw something I recognized. A good person in an impossible situation, needing what I need. A chance at something different. Margaret's heart began to beat faster. Mr. Fletcher, what are you saying? Thomas met her eyes directly. I'm saying that maybe we could help each other. I'm saying that if you're willing, if you think you could bear the idea of marrying a man you've known. For all of 30 minutes, I'd like to offer you a proposition. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. Are you proposing marriage? To me, I am. Thomas's voice was steady, but she could see the nervousness in the way his hands gripped his coffee cup. I know it sounds crazy. I know we're strangers. But Miss O'Sullivan, I've got a farm that needs a woman's touch, 2 children who need a mother, and a life that's half empty without someone to share it. And you need a home and a family and a man who'll treat you with respect. Margaret felt dizzy. But you don't know anything about me. I could be terrible with children. I could be a poor housekeeper. Could you be worse than the mess I've made of things on my own? Thomas asked with a slight smile. Miss O'Sullivan, Margaret, I saw how you held yourself together out there when that man was trying to break you down. I saw dignity and strength and grace under the worst circumstances. That tells me more about your character than months of courtship might. This is insane, Margaret whispered. But there was wonder in her voice rather than rejection. Maybe it is, Thomas agreed. But sometimes insane is the only choice that makes sense. He leaned back in his chair. I won't lie to you about what I'm offering. The farm's struggling, money's tight, the work is hard, and the children... Well, Emma's been protective of her father since her mother died, and Samuel's clingy because he misses having a mother. It wouldn't be easy. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing. Back to Boston meant returning to her aunt's disappointment and an uncertain future. Forward with this stranger meant what? Security, a purpose, children who might learn to love her. Would you... She began carefully. Would you expect a real marriage? I mean, would you expect me to... Thomas's cheeks reddened slightly. I'd expect companionship and partnership. Anything beyond that would have to grow naturally if it grew at all. I'm not looking for a housekeeper I can use as I please. Margaret, I'm looking for a partner to help me build something worthwhile. Margaret felt tears coming again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed on the platform. These carried hope instead of despair. Why would you do this for a stranger? Because, Thomas said quietly. "Maybe we're not meant to be strangers forever. Maybe sometimes the best things happen when two people who need each other find each other at exactly the right moment." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw the same desperate hope she felt in her own heart. Here was a man who'd known love and loss, who was offering her not passion, but something perhaps more valuable, a chance to belong somewhere, to matter to someone, to build a life with meaning. "If I said yes," she said slowly, "when would this happen?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Today, if you're willing. I know Reverend Hayes would perform the ceremony, and Dr. Mitchell could serve as witness. We could be married before the afternoon train arrives." The enormity of it took Margaret's breath away. This morning she'd awakened believing she was traveling toward a new life with Walter Grimsby. Now she was contemplating marrying a completely different man, a stranger who'd shown her more kindness in 30 minutes than she'd received in months. "Mr. Fletcher, Thomas," she corrected herself. "If we do this, I want you to know that I'll try my very best to be a good wife to you and a good mother to your children. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise I'll care." Thomas reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. His skin was rough from farm work, but his touch was careful and warm. "And I promise I'll treat you with respect and kindness, always. You'll never have to fear being sent away or made to feel unwanted in our home." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. In his eyes, she saw not the romantic love of fairy tales, but something that might be more enduring. Genuine affection, mutual respect, and the solid foundation upon which a real partnership could be built. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, Thomas Fletcher. I'll marry you." No, the smile that spread across Thomas's face transformed it completely, showing her a glimpse of the man he'd been before grief and hardship had worn him down. "Then let's go find Reverend Hayes," he said, standing and offering his arm. "Let's start our life together." As they stepped out of the station cafe into the crisp October air, Margaret felt the weight of their decision settling over her like a cloak. Thomas walked beside her with purposeful strides, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked, as if he were rehearsing the words he'd need to convince Reverend Hayes that this wasn't the act of two people who'd taken leave of their senses. "The church is just down Main Street," Thomas said, loading Margaret's trunk into his wagon with practiced efficiency. "Reverend Hayes, well, he's a good man, but he can be particular about propriety. He performed Sarah's funeral service, so he knows my situation." Margaret smoothed her traveling dress, wishing she had something more appropriate for a wedding, even one as unconventional as this would be. "What will you tell him about how we met?" Thomas paused in securing her carpet bag. "The truth. That you came here to marry a man who proved himself unworthy, and that I believe you deserve better than being abandoned in a strange place with nowhere to go." The simplicity of his answer steadied her nerves somewhat. There was no deception in Thomas Fletcher, no attempt to make their arrangement sound more romantic than it was. Margaret found that refreshing after months of Walter Grimsby's flowery letters that had promised so much and delivered only humiliation. They made their way down Main Street, past Henley's general store, where Margaret could see faces pressed against the windows, watching their progress with undisguised curiosity. Word of the morning's events had clearly spread, and she could feel the weight of scrutiny following them like a shadow. The Millfield Community Church was a modest, white-painted building with a simple steeple that reached toward the pale morning sky. Thomas helped Margaret down from the wagon, his hand steady and reassuring under her elbow, before leading her up the front steps. They found Reverend William Hayes in the sanctuary, polishing the brass candlesticks on the altar with methodical care. He was a man in his 50s, with greying hair and the lean build of someone who'd spent years ministering to farmers and their families. When he looked up and saw Thomas approaching with Margaret, his weathered face registered first surprise, then concern. "Thomas," Reverend Hayes said, setting down his polishing cloth, "I heard there was some commotion at the station this morning. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Reverend," Thomas replied, removing his hat, "but I need to ask you for something important." He gestured toward Margaret. "This is Miss Margaret O'Sullivan. She's the young lady who was mistreated at the station today." Reverend Hayes studied Margaret with kind but cautious eyes. "Miss O'Sullivan, I'm sorry for what you experienced this morning. Mr. Grimsby's behavior was inexcusable." "Thank you, Reverend," Margaret said quietly. "Your sympathy means more than you know." Thomas took a deep breath. "Reverend Hayes, I've asked Miss O'Sullivan to marry me, and she's accepted. We'd like you to perform the ceremony today, as soon as possible." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Reverend Hayes looked between them, his expressions cycling through shock, concern, and what might have been disapproval. "Thomas," he said carefully, "surely you can't be serious. You've known this young lady for what, an hour? 2 hours at most?" "Long enough to know she's a good woman who deserves better than what happened to her today," Thomas replied firmly, "and long enough to know that we might be able to help each other." Reverend Hayes set down the candlestick he'd been holding and walked closer to them. "Thomas, I've known you since you were a boy. I baptized you, married you to Sarah, buried Sarah, and christened your children. You're not a man given to rash decisions." "No, sir, I'm not," Thomas agreed. "But I'm also not a man who can stand by and watch someone suffer when I might be able to help. Miss O'Sullivan needs a home and a family. My children need a mother, and I need a partner to help me build something worthwhile on the farm." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Being discussed as if she weren't present reminded her uncomfortably of the morning's humiliation, but she forced herself to remain quiet. This was Thomas's community, and he would need to convince his minister without her interference. Reverend Hayes turned his attention to Margaret. "Miss O'Sullivan, forgive me for speaking plainly, but you've traveled a great distance to marry. One man only to find yourself proposing to marry another within hours of your arrival. Are you certain this is what you want, and not simply what desperation is driving you toward?" Margaret lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Reverend Hayes, I won't pretend that desperation isn't part of my decision. I have very few options available to me. But I've spoken with Mr. Fletcher, and I believe him to be a good and honest man. If he's willing to offer me a place in his family, I'm prepared to do everything in my power to be worthy of that trust." "Marriage is a sacred covenant," Reverend Hayes said, his voice taking on the cadence of a man accustomed to delivering sermons. "It's not meant to be a business arrangement or a solution to practical problems. It's a union of hearts and souls, blessed by God and intended to last until death parts the couple." Thomas stepped forward. "With respect, Reverend, you married Sarah and me when we barely knew each other. Her father had debts, and my father offered a good bride price. Love came later, but it did come. Some of the strongest marriages in this community started with practical considerations." "That was different," Reverend Hayes protested. "Your families had known each other for years. There was time for proper courtship, for the banns to be read, for Sarah to die before she was 30, Thomas interrupted, his voice rough, with old pain. "Reverend, I'm not asking you to marry us because we're madly in love. I'm asking you to marry us because we're two people who can help each other build something good. Isn't that what marriage is supposed to be? A partnership in facing life's challenges?" Margaret watched the internal struggle play out on Reverend Hayes's face. She could see him weighing his pastoral duties against his genuine care for Thomas, his concern for propriety against his compassion for her situation. "Miss O'Sullivan," the Reverend said finally, "may I ask about your faith? Are you a Christian woman?" "I am," Margaret replied. "I was raised Presbyterian, though I attended whatever church was available in Boston. I believe in God's providence, Reverend Hayes, and I believe he sometimes works through unexpected circumstances." Reverend Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between them. "Thomas, if I agree to this, and I haven't decided that I will, what assurances can you give me that you'll honor the vows you make? That you won't treat this young lady as a hired hand who happens to share your name?" "You have my word," Thomas said solemnly. "Margaret will be my wife in every way that matters. She'll have a place at my table, a voice in decisions about our home and children, and my protection for as long as we both shall live." "And Miss O'Sullivan, what assurances can you give that you won't abandon this family when something better comes along? Marriage isn't something you can walk away from when it becomes difficult." Margaret felt the weight of the question. "I understand that, Reverend. I've spent the last 12 years caring for my sick aunt, watching her grow more demanding and difficult with each passing month, never once considering abandoning my duty to her. If I give my word to Mr. Fletcher and his children, it will be kept." Reverend Hayes studied them both for another long moment before sighing deeply. "I'm going to ask Dr. Mitchell to join us. If we're going to do this irregular thing, we'll need a witness beyond myself." Margaret felt a surge of relief mixed with fresh nervousness. "You'll perform the ceremony?" "Against my better judgment, yes," Reverend Hayes said. "But I want to be clear about something. The vows you'll speak are the same ones any couple speaks in this church. You'll promise to love, honor, and cherish each other. If you're not prepared to at least try to fulfill those promises, speak now." Thomas looked at Margaret, and she saw uncertainty in his eyes for the first time that morning. "Margaret, are you sure about this?" She thought about the train that would carry her back to Boston in a few hours, back to her aunt's disappointed sighs and the prospect of becoming an unwanted burden again. Then she thought about Thomas's gentle voice, his steady presence, the possibility of children who might learn to love her. "I'm sure," she said firmly. Dr. James Mitchell arrived within minutes of Reverend Hayes sending for him, and Margaret could see immediately why Thomas considered him a friend. The doctor was a man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes, and the quiet competence that came from years of dealing with crisis situations. When Reverend Hayes explained what was happening, Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows rose, but he didn't argue. "Thomas," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, drawing him aside while Reverend Hayes prepared for the ceremony. "Are you certain about this? It's not like you to act impulsively." "I'm certain," Thomas replied, though Margaret could hear the nervous edge in his voice. "She's a good woman, James. She deserves better than what happened to her today." "That's admirable, but it's not necessarily a reason to marry someone," Dr. Mitchell pointed out gently. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Did you see how she held herself together when Grimsby was humiliating her? She didn't break down, didn't beg, didn't lose her dignity even when he was trying to strip it away. That takes strength, James. Real strength. And God knows I need someone strong enough to help me raise those children." Dr. Mitchell nodded slowly. "And what about you? What do you need besides help with Emma and Samuel?" Thomas glanced toward Margaret, who was speaking quietly. "With Reverend Hayes about the ceremony. I need to stop feeling like I'm drowning every day. I need someone to talk to who understands what it means to carry responsibility for other people. I need—" He struggled for the words. "I need to stop being so alone." "All right then," Dr. Mitchell said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "If you're determined to do this, I'll stand with you." Reverend Hayes called them together near the altar, the morning light streaming through the church's simple windows and casting everything in a soft, golden glow. Margaret wished desperately for a proper wedding dress, for flowers, for some sign that this moment was as important as it felt. Instead, she smoothed her traveling dress once more and tried to calm her racing heart. "We have no rings," Reverend Hayes observed. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. "My wife's ring is upstairs in the parsonage. She always removes it when she's baking bread. And I believe there's a simple band that belonged to my mother somewhere in the desk drawer." "Go fetch them," Reverend Hayes said. "We'll do this properly, even if it's happening quickly." While Dr. Mitchell was gone, Margaret found herself standing alone with Thomas before the altar. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of what they were about to do. "Are you frightened?" Thomas asked quietly. "Terrified," Margaret admitted, "but not of you. I'm frightened of disappointing you, of not being what your children need, of not knowing how to be part of a family." Thomas turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I can't promise this will be easy. I can't promise you'll love the life we'll build together, but I can promise you'll never have to face it alone." Something in his voice made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. Not the desperate tears she'd shed that morning, but tears of gratitude for this unexpected kindness from a stranger who was about to become her husband. Dr. Mitchell returned with 2 simple gold bands, and Reverend Hayes opened his prayer book. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying the solemn authority of countless ceremonies, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Margaret like a blessing. This wasn't the wedding she dreamed of as a young girl, but perhaps it was the wedding she needed, stripped of romance and pretense, focused on the serious business of 2 people promising to help each other through whatever life might bring. When it came time for vows, Thomas's voice was steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Margaret, to provide for her and protect her for all the days of his life. Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she made the same promises, but she meant every word. The ring Thomas slipped onto her finger was too large, but she closed her hand to keep it in place. When she placed the band on his finger, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly too. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Hayes said, and Margaret's heart stopped for a moment. Thomas stepped closer, his eyes searching hers for permission. When she nodded slightly, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, careful kiss that lasted only a moment, but somehow managed to convey both tenderness and respect. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Nebraska," Reverend Hayes announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with the marriage certificate, and Margaret watched in something approaching disbelief as Thomas signed his name with firm strokes, then handed the pen to her. When she wrote Margaret Fletcher for the first time, the name looked foreign on the paper, but somehow right. "Well," Dr. Mitchell said with a smile, "congratulations to the happy couple. Thomas, you'll bring your new wife by the house soon, so Mary can meet her properly." "Of course," Thomas agreed, though Margaret could hear the nervousness returning to his voice now that the ceremony was complete. Reverend Hayes shook both their hands with formal politeness. "I'll be praying for your marriage," he said, and Margaret wasn't entirely sure whether he meant that as a blessing or an acknowledgement that they'd need divine intervention to make this work. As they prepared to leave the church, Dr. Mitchell pulled Thomas aside once more. "The children," he said quietly. "How are you going to explain this to Emma and Samuel?" Thomas's face tightened with worry. "I don't know. Emma's been so protective since Sarah died. She might see Margaret as a threat to her mother's memory. And Samuel? Samuel might accept her more easily. He's young enough to adapt." Thomas glanced toward Margaret, who was thanking Reverend Hayes for performing the ceremony. "I just hope I haven't made a terrible mistake." "For what it's worth," Dr. Mitchell said, "I think you've chosen well. There's strength in that woman, and kindness too. Give it time." Outside the church, Thomas helped Margaret into the wagon with the careful courtesy of a man still learning how to be a husband. As they drove through town toward his farm, Margaret noticed how people stopped their conversations to stare. Word of their hasty marriage would be all over Millfield by evening. "Are you ready to meet Emma and Samuel?" Thomas asked as they left the town behind. Margaret looked down at the unfamiliar ring on her finger, then at the man beside her who was now her husband. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." Thomas nodded, his hands tight on the reins. "That's all any of us can do, I suppose. Try our best and hope it's enough." The farmhouse came into view as they crested a small hill, and Margaret felt her breath catch. It was smaller than she'd expected, clearly showing signs of neglect that spoke to the struggles of a man trying to manage too much on his own. But it was solid and well built, with a wide front porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. It was home. Her home now, for better or worse. As Thomas pulled the wagon up to the front porch, Margaret saw two small faces appear in the front window, then quickly disappear. Her new stepchildren were watching, waiting to see what their father had brought home. "Well, Mrs. Fletcher," Thomas said, using her new name for the first time, "welcome to your new life." Margaret straightened her shoulders and prepared to meet the children who would either accept her or make every day a battle. Either way, there was no turning back now. She was Margaret Fletcher, wife and stepmother, and she would make the best of what Providence had given her. As Thomas brought the wagon to a stop in front of the farmhouse, Margaret felt her stomach clench with nervous anticipation. The two small faces had vanished from the window, but she could sense their presence, the weight of their judgment waiting. Just beyond the front door, Thomas sat beside her for a moment, his hands still gripping the reins, as if he too needed time to prepare for what came next. "They're shy around strangers," he said quietly, though Margaret suspected there was more to it than simple shyness. Emma especially. She's been protective since Sarah died. Margaret nodded, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "What have you told them about me?" "Nothing yet," Thomas admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I left this morning to get supplies. They have no idea what's happened." The weight of that revelation settled over Margaret like a cold blanket. These children were about to learn that their father had not only married a stranger, but brought her home to live with them permanently. The shock alone might be devastating, never mind the complex emotions that would follow. Thomas climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her. His hands were steady as he lifted her down, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw worked as he struggled with what to say to his children. "We'll go in together," he said, reaching for her carpet bag. "I'll explain as best I can." The front porch creaked under their feet, and Margaret noticed how the boards sagged in places, how paint peeled from the railings like old skin. The house had good bones, but it showed clear signs of neglect, the kind that came from a man trying to manage too much on his own. Weeds had overtaken what had once been a flower garden, and one of the shutters hung at an odd angle. Thomas paused with his hand on the door latch. "Margaret, I should warn you, the house, it's not what it should be. I've been focused on keeping the farm running, and things inside have, well, you'll see." He opened the door, and Margaret stepped into her new home for the first time. The front room was dark, with heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon light. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, the lingering staleness of a house that hadn't had a woman's touch in too long. Dishes sat unwashed on a side table, and dust motes danced in the thin streams of light that managed to penetrate the gloom. "Emma, Samuel," Thomas called softly, "come out here, please. I need to talk to you." Margaret heard whispered voices from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by the sound of reluctant footsteps. A door creaked open, and the children emerged from what must have been the kitchen. A girl of 6 with Thomas's grey eyes and light brown hair braided with more practicality than care, and a boy who looked like a smaller, gentler version of his father. Emma moved with the careful dignity of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. She positioned herself slightly, in front of Samuel, her chin raised in unconscious mimicry of an adult preparing for battle. Samuel peeked out from behind his sister, his thumb creeping toward his mouth before Emma's sharp look made him drop his hand. "Children," Thomas began, his voice strained, "I want you to meet someone very important. This is Mrs. Margaret Fletcher. She's going to be living with us now." Emma's eyes narrowed with suspicion that was far too sharp for a 6-year-old. "Fletcher? But that's our name." Thomas cleared his throat. "Yes, that's because Margaret and I got married today. She's my wife now, which means she's your new mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret watched, Emma's face cycle through confusion, shock, and what could only be described as betrayal. Samuel looked between his father and Margaret with wide, uncertain eyes. "Married?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of accusation. "You got married? To her?" "Emma," Thomas said gently, "I know this is sudden, but where were we?" Emma interrupted, her voice rising. "Why weren't we at your wedding? Mama always said families do important things together." Margaret felt her heart break a little at the pain in the child's voice. She knelt down, bringing herself to Emma's eye level, and spoke with careful gentleness. "Emma, I know this must be very confusing and frightening. Your father and we met only this morning, and everything happened very quickly." Emma's eyes flashed with anger. "This morning? You met this morning and you married her?" The last word was directed at Thomas, with an accusatory force that made him flinch. "Emma, please!" Thomas tried, but his daughter was beyond listening. "Mama's only been gone 2 years, Emma said, her voice trembling with fury and grief. 2 years. Papa, did you forget about her already?" "I could never forget your mother," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Emma, I will never forget her." "Then why did you marry someone else?" Emma demanded, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "Why did you replace her?" Margaret felt each word like a physical blow. She had known this would be difficult, but hearing herself described as a replacement for a beloved mother was more painful than she had expected. Samuel, meanwhile, had been studying Margaret with the frank curiosity of a 4-year-old. While his sister raged, he stepped closer, his head tilted to one side. "Are you really going to be our mama now?" Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm going to try to take good care of you and your sister, Samuel. I know I can never replace your mother, but I hope we can be friends." "I don't want a new mama," Emma declared fiercely. "I want my real mama back." Thomas knelt beside Margaret, reaching for Emma's hands. "Sweetheart, your mama can't come back. You know that. But Margaret is here to help us, to take care of our family." Emma jerked her hands away. "We don't need help. We were doing fine by ourselves." Margaret looked around the dusty, neglected room and bit back her response. They clearly did need help, but pointing that out would only make Emma more defensive. "Emma," Margaret said softly, "I'm not here to take your mother's place. No one could do that. I'm here to help your father take care of you and Samuel, and maybe we can learn to care about each other." Emma's response was to turn and run from the room, her feet pounding up the stairs. A door slammed somewhere, above them, and the house seemed to shake with the force of her rejection. Samuel watched his sister's dramatic exit with solemn eyes, then looked back at Margaret. "Emma's sad a lot," he said matter-of-factly. She cries at night sometimes when she thinks Papa can't hear." Thomas's face crumpled with guilt and pain. "Samuel, why don't you go wash up for supper while I show Margaret around the house?" The boy nodded and trotted off toward the kitchen, leaving Thomas and Margaret alone in the dim front room. Thomas ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of his distress. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I knew Emma would be upset, but I didn't expect. I should have prepared them better." "How could you have prepared them for something you didn't know was going to happen until this morning?" Margaret asked gently. "Thomas, she's grieving. It's going to take time." Thomas nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "Let me show you the rest of the house," he said. "You should know what you've gotten yourself into." The tour was brief and sobering. The kitchen was functional, but clearly hadn't seen a thorough cleaning in months. Dishes were stacked haphazardly, and the stove needed a good scrubbing. The parlour was better maintained, but dust covered most surfaces, and cobwebs gathered in the corners. Upstairs, Thomas hesitated before opening the door to what had clearly been the master bedroom. This is where Sarah and I slept," he said quietly. "I've been sleeping downstairs since she died. I couldn't." Margaret stepped into the room and immediately understood his difficulty. Sarah's presence lingered everywhere, in the hairbrush still sitting on the dresser, the shawl draped over the chair, the book lying open on the bedside table as if she'd simply stepped out for a moment and would return to finish reading. "I know I should have packed her things away," Thomas said from the doorway, "but Emma gets so upset when I touch anything that belonged to her mother." Margaret walked to the window and pulled back the curtains, letting light flood the room, for what was probably the first time in 2 years. "We don't have to change anything tonight," she said practically. "But Thomas, you can't sleep downstairs forever. This is your room, your bed. We're married now." Or Thomas's cheeks reddened. I assumed you might prefer to sleep separately until we know each other better." Margaret turned to face him, seeing the uncertainty and guilt warring in his expression. "We're husband and wife," she said firmly. "I won't have the children thinking this isn't a real marriage, but the bed is certainly large enough for both of us to sleep without presuming anything more." Relief and something else, perhaps gratitude, flickered across Thomas's features. "Thank you for understanding." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to assess the true scope of what she'd taken on. The house needed extensive cleaning. The children needed structure and comfort, and Thomas needed someone to help him carry the enormous burden he'd been shouldering alone. That evening, as Margaret unpacked her few belongings into Sarah's dresser, she found herself surrounded by reminders of the woman whose place she was trying to fill. A photograph on the dresser showed a lovely young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Emma's smile, Margaret realized. From downstairs she could hear Thomas talking quietly to Samuel, while Emma remained barricaded in her room, refusing to come down for supper. The sound of Thomas's patient voice, the way he gentled his tone for his son, told her more about the kind of man she'd married than hours of conversation might have revealed. As she prepared for her first night as Mrs. Fletcher, Margaret said, "A silent prayer for wisdom, for patience, and for the strength to build something good from the complicated circumstances that had brought her here. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was exactly where Providence had placed her, in a house that needed her skills, with children who needed her care, and beside a man who, despite his grief and uncertainty, had offered her the gift of belonging." Outside her window, the Nebraska sky darkened toward night, and Margaret Fletcher settled into her new life with determination and hope. Part 5. Building Routines and Facing Judgment. 3 weeks into her new life as Mrs. Fletcher, Margaret had established a rhythm that transformed the farmhouse from a monument to grief into something resembling a home. She rose before dawn to start the stove and prepare breakfast, the familiar tasks grounding her in this strange new world. The kitchen, once cluttered with unwashed dishes and neglected corners, now gleamed with the kind of order that came from practiced hands and determined effort. Samuel had adapted to her presence with the resilience of a child who craved maternal attention. He followed her around the house like a small shadow, chattering about everything and nothing while she worked. When she discovered he couldn't yet tie his shoes properly, she spent patient mornings teaching him, celebrating each small victory as if he'd conquered mountains. "Look, Margaret," he called one morning, holding up his foot with pride. "I did it all by myself." "That's wonderful, Samuel," Margaret said, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Your father will be so proud when he sees." Samuel beamed at the praise, and Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. She was beginning to understand what Thomas meant about needing someone to share the burden. There was deep satisfaction in being needed, in watching a child's confidence bloom under her care. Emma, however, remained a fortress of resistance. She submitted to Margaret's household rules with cold politeness, ate the meals Margaret prepared without comment, and answered direct questions with the minimum required courtesy. But she watched Margaret's every move with suspicious eyes, as if waiting for some betrayal or evidence that this new arrangement was temporary. The confrontation Margaret had been dreading came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she heard Emma's sharp intake of breath from the master bedroom. "What are you doing?" Emma's voice carried a note of panic that made Margaret's stomach clench. Margaret looked up from the drawer she'd been organizing, Sarah's drawer, she realized with a sinking heart. In her effort to make space for her own few belongings, she'd moved some of Sarah's things to make room. "I was just organizing," Margaret said carefully, "making space for my things." Emma's face flushed with anger and something deeper, fear. "Those are Mama's things. You can't touch Mama's things." "Emma, I was very careful with everything. I just moved some items to—" "You have no right." Emma's voice rose to a near shout. "This is Mama's room, and those are Mama's things, and you're not supposed to touch them." Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by his daughter's distress. His face tightened as he took in the scene. Margaret kneeling beside the open drawer, Emma's tear-streaked face, the visible evidence of change in what had been Sarah's sacred space. "What's happening here?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already understood. "She moved Mama's things," Emma said, pointing an accusatory finger at Margaret. "She's trying to make Mama disappear." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame and frustration. "I wasn't trying to erase anything. I was just trying to make room for yourself," Emma finished coldly. "You're trying to take over everything that was Mama's." Thomas looked between them, clearly torn. Margaret could see the guilt in his eyes, the weight of trying to balance his daughter's grief against the practical needs of their new arrangement. "Emma," Thomas said gently, "Margaret is my wife now. She needs space for her belongings." "Then maybe she should sleep somewhere else," Emma shot back. "Maybe she should go back where she came from." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She rose slowly from beside the drawer, her hands shaking slightly as she smoothed her skirts. "You're right," Margaret said quietly. "This was your mother's room, and I should have asked before moving anything. I'm sorry." Emma blinked, clearly surprised by the apology. She'd been preparing for a fight, not for Margaret to concede the point. "I'll be more careful in the future," Margaret continued. "Your mother's memory is important, Emma. I don't want to take that away from you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Thomas studied Margaret's face, and she could see something like gratitude in his expression. "Emma apologized to Margaret for raising your voice?" "No," Emma said stubbornly. "I'm not sorry. She shouldn't touch Mama's things." Emma Fletcher. Thomas's voice carried a warning, but Margaret held up a hand. It's all right, Thomas. She's protecting something precious to her. I understand that. The incident left a tension in the house that lingered for days. Margaret found herself moving more carefully around Sarah's belongings, conscious of Emma's watching eyes. But she also noticed that Samuel had begun seeking her out for comfort when he scraped his knees or needed help with tasks that seemed beyond his young abilities. Their first trip to town as a family came at the end of Margaret's third week. Thomas needed supplies, and Margaret needed fabric to sew new curtains for the kitchen. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing that their hasty marriage had become the subject of considerable speculation throughout Millfield. "Are you sure you want to come?" Thomas asked as they prepared to leave. "I could get whatever you need." Margaret tied her bonnet firmly under her chin. "I can't hide on the farm forever, Thomas. People need to see that we're a real family." The ride to town was tense, with Emma maintaining her hostile silence while Samuel chattered nervously about everything he saw. As they approached the main street, Margaret could see people pausing in their activities to watch their wagon pass. At Henley's general store, the conversation stopped entirely when they walked through the door. Margaret felt the weight of stares like physical pressure against her skin. Mrs. Dorothy Henley emerged from behind the counter with the predatory smile of a woman who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "Well, well," Mrs. Henley said, her voice carrying clearly across the store. "If it isn't the new Mrs. Fletcher, how lovely to see you settling in so quickly." Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her, but she kept her voice level. "Good morning, Mrs. Henley. I was hoping to find some fabric suitable for kitchen curtains." "Of course you were," Mrs. Henley replied, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I imagine there's quite a lot of redecorating to be done, removing the old to make way for the new, as it were." Several other customers had gathered, clearly eager to witness this first public appearance of the controversial Mrs. Fletcher. Margaret was acutely conscious of her plain dress, her practical bonnet, the way she must appear to these people who had known and loved Sarah. "We have some lovely calico that just came in," Mrs. Henley continued, leading Margaret toward the fabric section, "though I suppose someone in your situation might prefer something less expensive." A comment about her situation was clearly meant to wound, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice interrupted. "Dorothy Henley, that's quite enough." Dr. Mitchell had entered the store and was watching the scene with obvious disapproval. "Mrs. Fletcher is a customer in your establishment. I suggest you treat her with the courtesy due any paying customer." Mrs. Henley's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, Dr. Mitchell. I was simply trying to be helpful." "Then help her find what she needs without commentary," Dr. Mitchell said firmly. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward the doctor, but also embarrassment at needing his intervention. She selected her fabric quickly, paid for her purchases, and endured the continued stares as they left the store. "That went better than expected," Thomas said quietly as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Better? Mrs. Henley practically called me a fortune hunter in front of half the town." "Yes, but Dr. Mitchell stood up for you," Thomas pointed out, "and Mrs. Patterson nodded at you when we passed. That's something." As they drove home, Margaret reflected on the complicated dynamics of small-town life. Some people, like Dr. Mitchell, seemed willing to give her a chance. Others, like Mrs. Henley, had clearly already decided she was an opportunist who had somehow trapped poor Thomas Fletcher into an unsuitable marriage. That evening, as Margaret tucked Samuel into bed, he surprised her with a question that had clearly been troubling him. "Margaret, are you going to stay with us forever?" Margaret smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "I hope so, Samuel. Why do you ask? Emma said you might leave when you find someone better to marry. Margaret's heart clenched. Samuel, I'm already married to your father. I can't marry anyone else. But what if you get tired of us? What if we're too much trouble? Margaret leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. Samuel Fletcher, you and your sister and your father are my family now. Families don't give up on each other, even when things are difficult. Promise? Samuel's voice was small and vulnerable in the darkness. I promise, Margaret said, and meant it with every fibre of her being. As she closed Samuel's door and prepared for her own bed, Margaret reflected on the complex web of relationships she was trying to navigate. The town's judgment was painful but manageable. Emma's resistance was harder to bear, but she was beginning to understand that the child's hostility came from fear rather than genuine dislike. The real challenge would be proving to everyone, including herself, that this marriage born of desperation could become something lasting and real. As she settled into bed beside Thomas, who was already asleep after another long day of farm work, Margaret said a quiet prayer for patience, wisdom, and the strength to weather whatever storms lay ahead. Outside, the Nebraska wind whistled around the farmhouse, but inside, the small family was slowly, carefully, learning to breathe in rhythm together. The morning that would shatter their fragile peace began like any other. Margaret rose before dawn to start the coffee and tend to the chickens, while Thomas prepared for another trip to town, this time to meet with the bank manager about extending their credit for spring seed. The autumn harvest had been disappointing, and they needed time to recover financially before the next planting season. Emma had been quieter than usual over breakfast, picking at her eggs with distracted movements. Samuel, sensitive to his sister's moods, had also grown subdued. Margaret watched them both with growing concern, recognizing the signs of some internal storm brewing in the 6-year-old's mind. I'll be back before supper, Thomas told Margaret as he prepared to leave. If Harrison agrees to the extension, we'll be able to order seed for spring planting. If not... He left the sentence hanging, but Margaret understood the implications. After Thomas departed, Margaret threw herself into her weekly cleaning routine. The house had begun to feel more like home under her care, though she remained constantly aware of the invisible boundaries Emma had drawn around her mother's memory. Today, however, Margaret felt compelled to tackle a task she'd been avoiding, organizing the sewing basket that sat in the corner of the parlor. Sarah's sewing box was a beautiful thing, made of polished cherry wood with tiny brass hinges and compartments for different types of thread and needles. It had sat untouched since Sarah's death, accumulating dust like a shrine. But Margaret had noticed Samuel's pants were in need of mending, and Emma's dresses were growing too short. The practical work needed to be done, regardless of the emotional weight the box carried. Margaret opened the lid carefully, revealing neat spools of thread in rainbow colors, packets of needles, and half-finished projects that Sarah would never complete. A child's dress, tiny and perfect except for the missing hem. A quilt square with intricate stitching that spoke of long evenings spent in careful work. Each item was a testament to Sarah's skill and love for her family. Working carefully, Margaret sorted through the contents, setting aside threads that had faded and needles that had rusted. She found Sarah's thimble, silver and worn smooth by years of use, and set it carefully in its own compartment. The half-finished projects she wrapped in tissue paper, intending to store them safely in case Emma might want them someday. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Emma's footsteps on the stairs or notice the child's presence in the doorway until a sharp gasp made her look up. Emma stood frozen in the parlor entrance, her face white with shock and growing fury. Her eyes fixed on Margaret's hands, which held Sarah's silver thimble. "What are you doing?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the force of an accusation. Margaret looked down at the thimble in her palm, suddenly understanding how this must look to the child. "I was organizing the sewing box," she said carefully. "Some of the threads had faded and I thought—" "You're touching Mama's things again." Emma's voice grew stronger, angrier. "You promised you wouldn't touch Mama's things." "Emma, I didn't promise that exactly. I said I would be more careful, and I am being careful. I'm just organizing—" "You're stealing!" Emma's accusation exploded from her like a dam bursting. "You're stealing Mama's things and trying to make them yours." Margaret set the thimble down gently in its proper place. "Emma, I would never steal anything that belonged to your mother. I was simply trying to take care of things that need care." But Emma was beyond reasoning. Weeks of suppressed grief and resentment poured out of her in a torrent of words. "You think you can just come here and take over everything? You think you can sleep in Mama's bed and use Mama's things and make Papa forget all about her?" "That's not true," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "I would never want your father to forget your mother." "Liar!" Emma screamed, the word echoing through the house. "You want to erase her. You want to pretend she never existed so you can have everything that was hers." Samuel appeared in the doorway, drawn by his sisters shouting. His face was pale with confusion and fear. "Emma? What's wrong?" "She's trying to steal Mama." Emma turned to her brother with desperate urgency. "She's touching all of Mama's special things and trying to make them hers instead." Margaret felt her heart breaking as she watched Samuel's face crumple with uncertainty. "Is that true?" he asked Margaret in a small voice. "No, Samuel," Margaret said gently. "I was just organizing the sewing box because I noticed your pants need mending. I thought—" "We don't need you to mend anything," Emma interrupted. "We were fine before. You came, we don't need you at all." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. All her insecurities, all her fears about not belonging anywhere, came rushing back with devastating force. "Emma, please." "I hate you," Emma screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I hate you, and I wish you would go away. I wish Papa had never married you. I wish you had stayed on that train and never come here." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel stared at his sister with wide, shocked eyes, while Margaret stood frozen, the child's words echoing in her mind like gunshots. "Emma Fletcher." Margaret's voice came out steady despite the trembling in her hands. "That is quite enough." But Emma wasn't finished. "You're not my mother, and you're never going to be my mother. I already have a mother, and she's beautiful and good, and she didn't try to trick Papa into marrying her." Margaret felt something inside her chest crack and break. Every insecurity she'd carried about her appearance, her worth, her right to be part of this family, came flooding back with brutal clarity. She was exactly what Emma said, a stranger who had inserted herself into a family that neither wanted nor needed her. "You're right," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I'm not your mother, and I never should have tried to be." She walked past Emma toward the stairs, her movements careful and controlled despite the chaos in her heart. Behind her, she heard Samuel's confused voice asking Emma why she was so mean, but she couldn't stop to comfort him. Not now, when she felt like she was drowning in the truth of Emma's words. In the bedroom, Sarah's bedroom as Emma had reminded her, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. The silver wedding ring Thomas had placed there felt heavy and foreign, a symbol of promises that perhaps should never have been made. She had enough money saved for a train ticket back to Boston, not much more than that, but enough to escape this impossible situation before she caused any more damage to this grieving family. Her aunt would not welcome her return, but perhaps she could find work as a governess or companion to some family that needed her services, without the complications of marriage and stepmotherhood. The sound of the front door opening interrupted her thoughts. Thomas was home earlier than expected, and she could hear Emma's voice immediately launching into a tearful explanation of the morning's events. Margaret couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. She was being painted as the villain who had violated sacred boundaries. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Thomas's approach. He appeared in the doorway, his face grim with exhaustion and something that might have been disappointment. "Margaret," he said quietly, "Emma told me what happened." Margaret didn't look up from her hands. "I'm sure she did." Thomas entered the room and closed the door behind him. "She said you were going through Sarah's sewing box." "I was organizing it," Margaret said. "Some of the threads had faded, and I noticed Samuel's pants needed mending. I thought—" She trailed off, realizing how futile explanations seemed now. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Emma also said you told her you never should have. Tried to be her mother." Margaret finally looked up at him. "She's right about that. I've been fooling myself, thinking I could somehow become part of this family. But I can't replace Sarah, Thomas. I can never be what she was to you and the children." "I never asked you to replace Sarah," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Didn't you?" Margaret asked. "When you married me, wasn't that exactly what you were asking? For someone to fill the hole Sarah's death left in your family?" Thomas sat heavily in the chair by the window, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. Maybe it was. God help me, maybe it was. The admission hung between them like a confession of failure. Margaret felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. She had cried enough tears over situations beyond her control. "I could leave," she said quietly. "I have enough money for a train ticket. I could go back to Boston, and you could tell people. Well, you could tell them whatever you thought best." Thomas looked at her sharply. "Is that what you want?" Margaret considered the question seriously. What did she want? Did she want to return to Boston and face her aunt's vindication, her smug satisfaction at Margaret's failure? Did she want to give up on Samuel's sweet affection and the possibility that someday Emma might learn to accept her? Did she want to abandon the first real home she'd known since her parents died? "I want to belong somewhere," she said finally. "I want to matter to someone, but I don't want to destroy a family in the process." "You're not destroying anything," Thomas said, but the words sounded automatic. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of wagon wheels outside drew their attention. Thomas went to the window and cursed under his breath. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "Dr. Mitchell," Thomas said grimly, "and he looks like he's bringing bad news." They went downstairs together to find Dr. Mitchell standing in the front yard, his medical bag in hand, and his face grave with concern. "Thomas," Dr. Mitchell said as they emerged from the house, "I came as soon as I heard." "Heard what?" Thomas asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected. "About what happened at the bank. Harrison turned you down for the credit extension, didn't he?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Word travels fast. Dorothy Henley was in my office not an hour ago, full of righteous satisfaction about your comeuppance. According to her, Harrison told half the town that he couldn't risk lending money to a man who'd shown such poor judgment in his personal affairs." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. The bank had refused Thomas credit because of their marriage, because of her. "That's not all," Dr. Mitchell continued. "Peterson's refusing to sell you seed on credit, and there's talk that others might follow suit. Dorothy's been working overtime, spreading the word that you've lost your mind and can't be trusted to make sound business decisions." Thomas ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Margaret had learned to recognize as a sign of his deepest distress. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that you might lose the farm if you can't plant in spring," Dr. Mitchell said bluntly. "Thomas, I can lend you some money privately, but it won't be enough to cover everything you need." Margaret listened to this exchange with growing horror. Her presence in Thomas's life wasn't just disrupting his family, it was threatening his very livelihood. The farm that had been in his family for generations, the home his children had known all their lives, was at risk because he had shown kindness to a desperate woman at a train station. "This is my fault," Margaret said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. Dr. Mitchell's expression was sympathetic while Thomas's was unreadable. "Margaret," Thomas began. "No," Margaret interrupted. "Dr. Mitchell is right. People think you've lost your judgment because you married me so impulsively. They think I'm some kind of opportunist who took advantage of your grief." "What people think doesn't matter," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It matters when those people control whether you can get credit to plant your crops," Margaret replied. "It matters when it threatens your children's future." Dr. Mitchell looked between them with obvious concern. "Thomas, you need to think about this. Practically, your reputation in this community affects everything. Your ability to get fair prices for your crops, to get help during difficult times, to provide for Emma and Samuel." "So, what are you suggesting?" Thomas asked sharply. "That I abandon my wife because some small-minded people have opinions about our marriage?" "I'm suggesting that you consider what's best for your children," Dr. Mitchell said gently. Margaret felt the weight of that statement like a crushing blow. What was best for the children was clearly not her presence in their lives. Emma had made that abundantly clear, and now the financial consequences were threatening their security as well. "I should go," Margaret said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Margaret, no," Thomas said, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Yes," Margaret said with growing conviction. "I should go back to Boston. You can tell people. You can tell them we discovered we weren't suited, that we annulled the marriage. Your reputation would recover, and you could get the credit you need." "And what about you?" Dr. Mitchell asked gently. "What would you do in Boston?" Margaret lifted her chin with the dignity she'd maintained throughout all her trials. "I'll find work. I'll manage somehow. I always have." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Margaret could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a good man, torn between his protective instincts and the practical realities of providing for his children. She couldn't ask him to choose her over their security. "I don't want you to go," Thomas said finally, but the words lacked the force of true conviction. "But you think I should," Margaret replied, reading the truth in his expression. The silence that followed was answer enough. Margaret turned and went back into the house, her decision crystallizing with each step. She would pack her few belongings and take the evening train back to Boston. It would be better for everyone. For Emma, who would no longer have to see her mother's memory threatened. For Samuel, who deserved a stable home more than he deserved her affection. And for Thomas, who needed to rebuild his standing in the community more than he needed a wife he'd married out of pity. As she climbed the stairs to gather her things, Margaret tried to convince herself that leaving was the right choice. But with each item she folded into her carpet bag, she felt a piece of her heart breaking away. For a few brief weeks, she had known what it felt like to belong somewhere, to matter to someone, to be part of a family. Now she was returning to the familiar territory of being unwanted, unnecessary, and alone. From downstairs, she could hear Thomas and Dr. Mitchell continuing their conversation in low, urgent voices. Occasionally, Emma's voice joined in, and Margaret was certain the child was arguing passionately for her departure. Samuel's voice was notably absent, and Margaret hoped he was too young to fully understand what was happening. As she closed her carpet bag and prepared to carry it downstairs, Margaret took one last look around the room that had briefly been hers. Sarah's photograph smiled at her from the dresser, and Margaret found herself speaking to the image of the woman whose place she had tried so inadequately to fill. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't be what they needed. I'm sorry I disrupted the peace you left behind." With that, Margaret Fletcher prepared to become Margaret O'Sullivan once again, returning to a world where she had no place, but at least brought no harm to those who deserved better than what she could offer. Margaret's hand was on the latch of her carpet bag when Samuel's frightened voice called from down the hall. "Papa! Papa, come quick! Something's wrong with Emma!" The urgency in the 4-year-old's voice cut through Margaret's despair like a blade. She dropped her bag and rushed toward Emma's room, arriving at the same time as Thomas, who had taken the stairs 2 at a time. Emma lay in her small bed, her face flushed with fever and her breathing shallow and rapid. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, and when Thomas placed his hand on her forehead, he pulled it back with alarm. "She's burning up," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Samuel, when did she start feeling sick?" "After you went outside," Samuel said, his thumb creeping toward his mouth. "She said her head hurt, and then she got really hot and wouldn't wake up all the way." Dr. Mitchell, who had followed them upstairs, immediately took charge. He examined Emma with practiced hands, checking her pulse and listening to her breathing. "It's a fever, but not dangerously high yet. Could be any number of things: scarlet fever, influenza, or just a childhood illness running its course." "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his usual composure cracking under the weight of seeing his daughter so vulnerable. "Keep her cool, give her plenty of fluids, and watch her carefully," Dr. Mitchell replied. "If the fever spikes, or she develops a rash, call for me immediately. Otherwise, this will likely run its course in a few days." Margaret found herself moving without conscious thought, going to the washstand to prepare cool cloths. Years of caring for her ailing aunt had taught her the rhythms of nursing the sick, the careful balance of keeping fever down without chilling the patient, the importance of small sips of water, the comfort that came from a gentle hand and a calm presence. "I can stay with her," Margaret said quietly, wringing out a cloth in cool water. "I have experience with fevers." Thomas looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten her presence in his worry for Emma. "Margaret, you don't have to." "I mean, after what happened earlier?" "She's sick," Margaret said simply. "Nothing else matters right now." Dr. Mitchell nodded approvingly. "She's right, Thomas. Emma needs nursing care, and Margaret is clearly capable of providing it. I'll check back tomorrow morning." After Dr. Mitchell left, and Thomas went to tend to the evening chores, Margaret settled into the chair beside Emma's bed. She placed a cool cloth on the child's fevered forehead and began the patient vigil that serious illness required. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling incoherently, other times lying still and worryingly quiet. Margaret kept the cloths cool, offered small sips of water when Emma was lucid enough to drink, and maintained the steady, calming presence that her aunt had always found comforting during her own periods of illness. It was near midnight when Emma's fever spiked dangerously high. Margaret had been dozing in her chair when the child's restless movements woke her. Emma was thrashing weakly, her nightgown soaked with sweat and her breathing labored. "Thomas," Margaret called softly but urgently. "Thomas, come quickly!" He appeared in the doorway within moments, having been sleeping in the parlor to be close if needed. One look at Emma's condition sent him into action, helping Margaret strip away the fever-soaked bedding and cool the child's burning skin with damp cloths. "Should I get Dr. Mitchell?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with fear. Margaret checked Emma's pulse, rapid but strong, and assessed her breathing. "Not yet. Let's see if we can bring the fever down first. Sometimes they spike, like this before breaking." For the next hour, they worked together in quiet efficiency, cooling Emma's fevered body and trying to make her comfortable. Margaret had seen fevers like this before and knew that the crisis point often came in the darkest hours before dawn. It was during one of Emma's more lucid moments that the breakthrough came. The child opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret with a clarity that had been absent for hours. "Mama," Emma whispered, her voice small and confused. Margaret's heart clenched. "No, sweetheart, it's Margaret. Your papa is right here too." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I want my mama. Where is my mama?" The question hung in the air, like a prayer and a lament. Thomas started to speak, probably to give the gentle explanation he'd given countless times about Mama being in heaven, but Margaret held up a soft hand. "Your Mama loved you very much," Margaret said quietly, smoothing Emma's damp hair. "She's not here anymore, but that love is still with you. It always will be." "I miss her so much," Emma whispered, tears sliding down her fevered cheeks. "I dream about her sometimes, but when I wake up, she's still gone." Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears. "I know, sweetheart. I lost my mama too, when I was not much older than you are now." Emma's fever-bright eyes focused on Margaret's face. "You did?" "I did, and my papa too. They got very sick, and no matter how much I wanted them to stay, they couldn't." "Did you miss them?" "Every single day," Margaret said honestly. "For a very long time, I was angry that they left me, and I was scared that if I cared about anyone else, they might leave me too." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. "Is that why you want to go away? Because you're scared Papa will leave you too?" The question caught Margaret off guard, with its perceptive simplicity. "Partly, yes. And because I don't want to make you sad by being here when you want your mama instead." Emma was quiet for so long that Margaret thought she'd fallen back into fevered sleep. But then the child spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared you'll leave like Mama did. Even though I said mean things to you, I'm scared you'll go away and not come back." Margaret felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This wasn't just grief and resentment she'd been fighting. It was fear. Emma was a 6-year-old child who had learned that mothers could disappear without warning, and she was terrified of caring about another mother figure, only to lose her too. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "would it help if I promised that even if you say mean things to me sometimes, I won't leave? That even when you're angry with me or missing your mama, I'll still be here?" Emma's eyes searched Margaret's face with desperate hope. "But what if you get sick like Mama did?" "I don't know what will happen in the future," Margaret said honestly. "Nobody knows that. But I can promise you that I will never, ever choose to leave you and Samuel and your papa. As long as I'm able to be here, I will be." "Promise?" Emma whispered. "I promise," Margaret said, leaning down to kiss the child's fevered forehead. Emma closed her eyes, and for the first time in hours, her breathing became deep and regular. The fever was finally breaking. Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway, approached the bed with wonder in his eyes. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "How did you know that was what she needed to hear?" Margaret looked up at him, exhaustion and relief making her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Because it's what I needed to hear when I was her age. Someone to promise they wouldn't choose to leave me." Thomas studied her face in the dim lamplight. "Is that what you've been afraid of? That we might choose to leave you?" Margaret nodded, suddenly feeling very young and vulnerable herself. "Everyone leaves, Thomas. My parents died. My aunt made it clear I was a burden. Walter Grimsby rejected me at the station. I've spent most of my life being someone people couldn't wait to be rid of." "Oh, Margaret," Thomas said softly. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I never wanted you to feel that way." "I know," Margaret said. "But when Emma said those things today, and when you realized how much trouble our marriage was causing, I thought maybe it would be easier for everyone if I just disappeared again." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. After Sarah died, he said finally, I thought I'd never want to share my life with anyone again. I loved her so much that the idea of caring about someone else felt like betrayal. Margaret listened, sensing that he was approaching something important. When I married you, Thomas continued, I told myself it was just, for practical reasons, companionship, help with the children, an end to the loneliness. I thought I could keep my heart safely locked away. And now? Margaret asked softly. Thomas looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, vulnerable, honest, and tinged with something that might have been wonder. Now I realize that somewhere between watching you care for Samuel and seeing you stand up to Dorothy Henley's gossip and watching you nurse Emma tonight, I've started to care about you. Not as a convenient arrangement, but as Margaret, as my wife. Margaret felt her breath catch. Thomas. I know it's not the grand romantic love that stories talk about, Thomas said quickly, but it's real, and it's growing stronger, every day. And if you left now, it wouldn't just be losing a housekeeper or a helper with the children. It would be losing you, and that would break something in me that I'm not sure could be fixed. Margaret stared at him, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. But the farm, the credit, what people are saying. We'll figure it out, Thomas said firmly. All of it, but not by giving up on us. They sat together in the quiet room, holding hands while Emma slept peacefully for the first time in hours. Outside, the Nebraska night was deep and still, but inside the farmhouse, something new was taking root. I don't want to leave, Margaret admitted finally. Even when I was packing my bag, I didn't want to go. This is the first place that's ever felt like home. Then stay, Thomas said simply. Stay and help me raise these children. Stay and help me save the farm. Stay and let's see what we can build together. Margaret nodded, tears finally spilling over. I'd like that very much. Thomas leaned over and kissed her gently, and this time it wasn't the awkward kiss of strangers at a wedding altar. It was the kiss of two people who had chosen each other, who were ready to build something real together. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Margaret immediately checked her temperature. The fever had broken completely, and the child's color was already returning to normal. She's going to be fine, Margaret said with relief. We all are, Thomas replied, and for the first time since their wedding day, Margaret believed it might be true. The next morning brought Dr. Mitchell for his promised check on Emma, who was sitting up in bed and demanding breakfast with the imperious manner of a child who felt much better. After examining her thoroughly, Dr. Mitchell pronounced her well, on the way to recovery. You did excellent work, Margaret, he told her as they walked downstairs together. Emma's fever broke cleanly, and she's already showing good energy. You clearly know how to care for the sick. Thank you, Margaret said. I had a lot of practice with my aunt. Dr. Mitchell paused at the front door. Margaret, I hope you know that not everyone in town shares Dorothy Henley's opinions about your marriage. There are plenty of us who think Thomas made a wise choice, even though we barely knew each other. Some of the strongest marriages I've seen started with less, Dr. Mitchell said with a smile. Love can grow from respect and mutual care just as well as from passion, maybe better in some cases. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. Reverend Hayes climbed down from his buggy with the careful dignity of a man bearing important news. Thomas, Margaret, he greeted them formally. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Reverend, Thomas said, though Margaret could hear the wariness in his voice. Would you like to come in for coffee? That would be very kind. They settled in the parlor, with Margaret serving coffee and small cakes she'd baked. That morning, Reverend Hayes accepted both with polite appreciation before getting to the purpose of his visit. I've been hearing disturbing reports about how some members of our community have been treating your family, he said without preamble. Specifically, I understand that certain individuals have been using their influence to cause you financial difficulties. Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. People are entitled to their opinions, Reverend, Thomas said carefully. They are, Reverend Hayes agreed. But they are not entitled to use those opinions to harm their neighbors. I've spoken with several members of the congregation about the situation, and I want you to know that you have more support than you might realize. What do you mean? Margaret asked. Reverend Hayes smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face. I mean that Peterson will be happy to sell you seed on credit for spring planting. I also mean that several families have expressed interest in purchasing early vegetables from your kitchen garden next summer, if Margaret is willing to expand it. Margaret felt her eyes widen with surprise. They have. Indeed. Mary Patterson, in particular, was very impressed with the quality of the preserves you brought to the church social last week. She's convinced several other ladies that your domestic skills would be an asset to our community. Thomas leaned forward. What about the bank? Reverend Hayes's expression grew more serious. Harrison is still being stubborn, I'm afraid. But Dr. Mitchell and I have discussed the possibility of organizing a private loan among church members to help you get through until the next harvest. We couldn't accept charity, Thomas said quickly. It wouldn't be charity, Reverend Hayes replied. It would be an investment in our community. You're good people, Thomas, and good farmers. You've had a difficult few years, but that doesn't change your character or your value to this town. Margaret felt tears threatening again. After weeks of feeling like an outsider who had brought nothing but trouble to her new family, the idea that some people actually wanted to help was almost overwhelming. Why? She asked quietly. Why would people do this for us? Reverend Hayes studied her with kind eyes. Because, my dear, some of us have been watching how you fitted into this family, and we've seen the good you've brought to it. Thomas looks less burdened than he has in years. The children are clearly thriving under your care, and you've handled the challenges you've faced with grace and dignity. He paused, then added, and because Dorothy Henley's version of Christian charity has been rubbing some people the wrong way for quite some time. Her treatment of you has reminded several folks that the Bible calls us to welcome strangers, not gossip about them. After Reverend Hayes left, Thomas and Margaret sat together on the front porch, watching the sun set over their fields. Emma and Samuel played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. I keep expecting to wake up and find this is all a dream, Margaret said softly. Thomas reached for her hand. If it is, I don't want to wake up. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, feeling truly at peace for the first time since arriving in Millfield. The challenges weren't over. There would still be financial pressures, still be people like Mrs. Henley who disapproved of their marriage, still be moments when grief and uncertainty threatened their fragile happiness. But they would face those challenges together as a family, with the support of people who had chosen to see the good in their unconventional beginning, rather than focus on its flaws. That night, as Margaret tucked Emma into bed, the child surprised her with a question. Margaret, are you happy you came to Nebraska? Margaret smoothed the covers and considered her answer carefully. I'm happy I found your family, she said finally. Even though it's been difficult sometimes, I'm grateful for all of it. Emma nodded solemnly. I'm glad you stayed, and I'm sorry I said those mean things to you. Apology accepted, Margaret said, kissing Emma's forehead. But Emma, even if you say mean things to me again sometime, and you probably will, because that's what children do, it won't change how much I care about you. Do you understand? Emma smiled, the first completely genuine smile she'd given. Margaret, since her arrival. I understand. Good night, Margaret. Good night, sweetheart. As Margaret closed Emma's door and prepared for her own bed, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. She'd arrived in Millfield as a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a member of a community that was slowly learning to accept her. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a young girl, but it was real and solid and hers. And that, Margaret thought as she settled beside her husband, was worth more than any fairy tale ending. The first crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow in early March, and Margaret felt her heart lift with the promise of spring. The long Nebraska winter had tested their newly formed family bonds, but they had emerged stronger. The farmhouse now bore the unmistakable signs of a woman's care: clean curtains at the windows, preserved vegetables from Margaret's expanded garden filling the pantry, and the warm smell of fresh bread that greeted Thomas when he came in from the fields. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas and Samuel work together to repair a section of fence damaged by winter storms. The sight filled her with quiet satisfaction. Samuel had grown taller over the winter months, his confidence blooming under the patient attention of both his father and stepmother. Emma, too, had changed, still protective of her mother's memory, but no longer viewing Margaret as a threat to it. "Margaret, can you help me with my sampler?" Emma called from the parlor, where she was practicing her needlework. "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret replied, wiping her hands on her apron. The word sweetheart came naturally now, no longer feeling foreign on her tongue. As she helped Emma work through a particularly tricky stitch, Margaret marveled at how completely her life had transformed. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman abandoned at a train station. Now she was integral to the rhythm of this household, needed and loved in ways she had never dared to imagine. The financial situation had stabilized thanks to the community support Reverend Hayes had organized. The private loan from church members had allowed Thomas to plant his spring crops, and Margaret's expanded vegetable garden was already bringing in additional income from sales to town families. More importantly, the public support from respected community members had begun to shift public opinion about their marriage. "There," Margaret said, helping Emma complete her row of stitches. "You're getting very good at this." Emma beamed with pride. "Mama always said needlework was important for a lady to know." Margaret smiled, no longer feeling a pang of inadequacy. At references to Sarah, "Your mama was right, and she would be very proud of how beautifully you're learning." It was Samuel who provided the moment that would later seem like a turning point. He came running into the house that afternoon, his face flushed with excitement and a small cut on his finger from helping with the fence work. "Mama! Mama! I hurt! My finger!" he called out, his voice filled with the automatic trust of a child seeking comfort. Margaret was already moving toward him with a clean cloth when the significance of what he'd said hit her. Samuel had called her Mama, not Margaret, but Mama. She knelt down to examine his small injury, her heart racing with the magnitude of that simple word. "Let me see, sweet boy," she said gently, cleaning the tiny cut and wrapping it carefully. "There, all better." Samuel threw his arms around her neck with uninhibited affection. "Thank you, Mama." From the parlor doorway, Margaret saw Emma watching with an expression that was complex but not hostile. When their eyes met, Emma simply nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She understood the significance of the moment and was giving her blessing. Thomas, who had witnessed the exchange from the kitchen doorway, caught Margaret's eye and smiled with such warmth that she felt her cheeks flush. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, he pulled her close as they sat by the fire. "Did you hear what Samuel called you today?" he asked softly. "I heard," Margaret replied, nestling against his shoulder. "It felt right." "Sarah would have liked you," Thomas said suddenly. "I know that sounds strange, but I think she would have approved of how you love our children." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. The peaceful domesticity of their evening was interrupted by a knock at the door. Thomas rose to answer it, returning with a letter that bore the familiar handwriting of Margaret's sister Ruth. Margaret's stomach clenched as she recognized the elegant script. Ruth's letters had been infrequent over the winter, and Margaret had begun to hope that her sister had accepted her new circumstances. But the thickness of this envelope suggested something more substantial than a brief update. "Aren't you going to open it?" Thomas asked, settling back beside her. Margaret broke the seal with trembling fingers and began to read. As her eyes moved down the pages, her expression grew increasingly troubled. Ruth's letter was filled with news from Boston, society, events, mutual acquaintances, and updates on Ruth's own children. But the real purpose became clear in the final paragraphs. "Dearest Margaret, I've been thinking about your situation there in Nebraska. While I admire your determination to make the best of things, I wonder if you've truly considered what you're sacrificing by staying. Aunt Helen has passed away. I know you had little fondness for her, but still, and she's left you a small inheritance, enough to live independently here in Boston if you chose to return. Charles and I have discussed it, and we would be happy to welcome you back into proper society. You could live with us until you find suitable lodgings, and I'm certain we could find you a position as a companion to one of our friends. You're still young enough to build a respectable life here, Margaret. I worry that you're wasting yourself in that wilderness, playing house with a man who married you out of desperation rather than love. Please consider it, dear sister. You deserve better than settling for a life of mere convenience." Margaret's hands shook as she finished reading. Ruth's words were kindly meant, but they cut deeply. The implication that Thomas had married her out of desperation rather than any genuine feeling, that she was wasting herself on farm life, that what she had built here was merely playing house. It all struck at her deepest insecurities. "What does she say?" Thomas asked, noticing her distress. Margaret folded the letter carefully, her mind racing. She's offering me a way back to Boston. Our aunt died and left me a small inheritance. Ruth thinks I should return to proper society." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "And what do you think?" Margaret looked around the parlor, at the sampler Emma had been working on, at Samuel's wooden toys neatly arranged in their basket, at the family Bible that now included her name written beside Thomas's in careful script. This was her life. Now her family, her home. But Ruth's words had awakened old doubts. Was she truly building something meaningful here, or was she simply accepting whatever life offered her because she was too afraid to demand better? Had Thomas grown to love her, as she had come to love him, or was she still just the convenient solution to his practical problems? "I don't know," Margaret admitted quietly. "I need time to think." Thomas's expression darkened. "What's to think about? I thought you were happy here." "I am happy," Margaret said quickly, "but Ruth makes valid points about what? About how you're wasting yourself on us?" Thomas's voice carried a sharp edge Margaret had never heard before. "About how you could do better than a struggling farmer and his children." Margaret felt a flash of anger at his tone. "That's not what she said." "Isn't it?" Thomas stood abruptly, beginning to pace. "Your sister thinks you're too good for this life, and part of you agrees with her." "That's not fair," Margaret protested. "I'm simply considering my options." "Options?" Thomas said the word like it tasted bitter. "After everything we've built together, you're considering options." Margaret rose as well, her own anger building. "Yes, Thomas, because unlike the first time I married you, I now have choices. I'm not desperate anymore. I could support myself if I needed to." "So this marriage is conditional, based on whether something better comes along?" The accusation hit Margaret like a slap. "How dare you suggest that?" After everything I've given to this family, how can you question my commitment? Because you're sitting here, reading letters about returning to Boston, instead of telling your sister that your home is here." Thomas's voice rose dangerously. "Because you're considering your options, instead of saying that you belong with us." Margaret felt tears of frustration and hurt spring to her eyes. "I have spent my entire life being handed from one situation to another, never having any choice in my fate. Forgive me if I want to be certain that staying here is truly what I want, and not just what circumstances have forced upon me." Thomas stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "And what would it take for you to be certain? What assurance do you need that I apparently haven't already given you?" Margaret looked at this man who had become her husband, her partner, the father of the children she had grown to love as her own. She saw the fear beneath his anger, the vulnerability that made him lash out rather than risk being abandoned again. "I need to know that you love me," she said quietly. "Not as a convenient arrangement, not as a solution to your problems, but as Margaret, as your wife." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, hurt, and something that might have been realization. "Of course I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "How could you think otherwise?" "Because you've never said it," Margaret replied. "Because when we married it was for practical reasons, and I've never been sure if that changed. For you, the way it changed for me." Thomas closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, taking her face in his hands. "Margaret Fletcher, I love you. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you make this house feel like a home. I love how you sing while you cook, and how you read to the children, and how you never once complained about the hardships we've faced together." Margaret felt her breath catch as he continued. "I love that Samuel calls you Mama, and that Emma trusts you with her needlework, and that you've become the heart of this family. I love you so much that the thought of you leaving terrifies me more than losing the farm or facing the entire town's disapproval." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thomas, I should have told you sooner," he said, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I should have made sure you knew that what we have is real, not just convenient. I love you, Margaret, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Margaret reached up to cover his hands with hers. "I love you, too," she whispered. "I think I started falling in love with you that very first day, when you showed me kindness, when everyone else showed me judgment." Thomas leaned down and kissed her with a passion that spoke of months of growing affection finally given voice. When they broke apart, Margaret felt as if the last piece of her heart had finally found its proper place. "So?" Thomas asked softly. "What will you tell your sister?" Margaret smiled through her tears. "That I'm exactly where I belong." The morning after their confrontation, Margaret woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, and Thomas's arm was wrapped protectively around her waist. She could hear the children's voices downstairs, Emma reading to Samuel from one of their picture books, a domestic symphony that filled her heart with contentment. Carefully extricating herself from Thomas's embrace, Margaret padded to the dresser where Ruth's letter lay like an accusation. She picked it up, reading once more the elegant words that promised security, respectability, and escape from the uncertainties of farm life. Then, without hesitation, she walked to the fireplace and dropped the letter into the dying embers. The fine paper caught instantly, Ruth's careful script dissolving into ash and smoke. With it went Margaret's last connection to the woman she had been: desperate, dependent, always accepting whatever life offered because she believed she deserved nothing better. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher," Thomas said softly from the bed, watching her with eyes still heavy with sleep and something deeper. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher," Margaret replied, turning to face him with a smile that felt different. more certain, more hers. I've made my choice. Thomas sat up, his hair tousled and his expression growing serious. And I choose this, Margaret said, gesturing around the room that had become truly theirs. I choose you and Emma and Samuel. I choose our life, together, whatever challenges it might bring. Thomas was out of bed and across the room in moments, pulling her into his arms with a fervour that spoke of relief and gratitude and love too long held back. When he kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had almost lost something precious and wouldn't make that mistake again. I love you, Margaret Fletcher, he whispered against her lips. I love you completely, desperately, forever. And I love you, she whispered back. My husband, my choice, my heart. Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by the clanging of the church bell in town, not the regular call to worship, but the frantic, irregular tolling that meant emergency. Thomas pulled away from Margaret, his face immediately alert. Fire, he said grimly, moving to the window. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the Henderson farm. Within minutes, the Fletcher family was racing toward town in their wagon, joining a stream of neighbors, all converging on the crisis. The Henderson farm was fully engulfed, the family standing helplessly in their yard, while flames consumed their home and threatened to spread to the barn, where their livestock were trapped. Margaret took one look at the chaos. People running in panic, Mrs. Henderson sobbing while her children clung to her skirts, men shouting conflicting orders about how to fight the blaze, and something inside her clicked into place. This was no different from managing a household crisis, just on a larger scale. Thomas, she called over the noise, take the men and form a bucket brigade from the well to the barn. Save the animals first. The house is lost. Without waiting for his response, she turned to the cluster of women standing frozen in shock. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Morrison, we need to organize shelter and supplies for the Henderson family. Mrs. Henley, your store is closest. Can you open it and gather blankets and food? Even Dorothy Henley, faced with Margaret's calm authority in the midst of chaos, simply nodded and hurried away to comply. Margaret organized the relief effort with the same quiet efficiency she brought to running her household. She dispatched children to carry messages, assigned women to prepare food and temporary shelter in the church, and coordinated the care of the Henderson children, while their parents dealt with the immediate crisis. When young Billy Henderson ran toward the burning barn, screaming that his dog was still inside, it was Margaret who caught him and held him back, then looked around for someone brave enough to attempt a rescue. I'll go, Thomas said, appearing, at her side covered in soot but unharmed. No, Margaret said firmly, you have children who need their father. Where's single men? Before anyone could respond, Dr. Mitchell emerged from the smoke carrying the terrified dog, his clothes singed, but his cargo safe. The cheer that went up from the crowd was nothing compared to Billy Henderson's sob of relief. As the day wore on and the immediate crisis passed, Margaret found herself at the center of the relief effort. She knew exactly how much food would be needed to feed the displaced family, how to organize sleeping arrangements in the church, how to inventory what the Hendersons had lost and what they would need to rebuild. Margaret, Mary Patterson said as evening approached, I don't know what we would have done without your organization today. You've been a godsend. Similar comments came from others throughout the day, even some who had been coolest toward. Her marriage began to see Margaret not as an outsider who had trapped poor Thomas Fletcher, but as a competent woman who had proven herself when the community needed her. Mrs. Henley, surprisingly, approached Margaret as they were finishing up at the church. I owe you an apology, the older woman said stiffly. Today showed me that I may have misjudged your character. Margaret looked at the woman who had made her life difficult for months. We all do what we think is best for our community, Mrs. Henley. I understand your concern for Thomas and the children. Yes, well, Mrs. Henley cleared her throat. Perhaps I was too hasty in my judgments. You've certainly proven yourself today. As they drove home that evening, the children exhausted from the day's excitement, Thomas reached over and took Margaret's hand. I was proud of you today, he said quietly. The way you took charge, organized everything. You were magnificent. Margaret squeezed his hand. I was exactly where I belonged, she said. Helping my community, standing beside my husband, being part of something larger than myself. No. Regrets about Boston? Thomas asked. Margaret smiled, thinking of Ruth's letter now reduced to ash in their fireplace. None at all. This is my home, Thomas. You and the children are my family. Nothing could make me leave you now. Emma, who had been dozing against Margaret's shoulder, stirred slightly. I'm glad you stayed, Mamma, she murmured sleepily. Margaret's heart swelled with joy at the simple acceptance in Emma's voice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a real family, bound not by desperation or convenience, but by choice and love and the unshakable certainty that they belonged to each other. October arrived with a crispness that reminded Margaret of her first morning in Millfield, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. The farmhouse glowed with fresh paint and new shutters. The garden overflowed with the abundance of Margaret's careful tending, and the sound of laughter echoed regularly through rooms that had once been silent with grief. Can you believe it's been a whole year? Thomas asked, wrapping his arms around Margaret's waist as she stood at the kitchen window, watching Emma and Samuel play in the yard. Margaret leaned back against his chest, marveling at how naturally they fit together now. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Today marked their first wedding anniversary, and the entire community had been invited to celebrate with them. Tables laden with food covered the front yard, and neighbors who had once whispered about their hasty marriage now came bearing gifts and genuine warmth. Dr. Mitchell approached them with a broad smile. Thomas, Margaret, congratulations on a year well lived. I have to say you've both exceeded my expectations. Even yours, James? Thomas laughed. You were one of the few who supported us from the beginning. I supported the idea of it, Dr. Mitchell corrected. But what you've built together, this happiness, this family, it's better than anything I dared hope for. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, though it had nothing to do with the celebration. She'd been waiting for the right moment to share her news, and perhaps their anniversary, surrounded by friends and family, was perfect. Thomas, she said quietly, taking his hand, I have something to tell you. Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. What is it? Margaret smiled, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, wonder, and then pure joy. Margaret, are you certain? Dr. Mitchell confirmed it yesterday, she said, glancing at their friend who was beaming with delight. Thomas whooped with joy, lifting Margaret off her feet and spinning her around while she laughed. The sound drew the attention of their guests, and soon Emma and Samuel were running over to see what the excitement was about. What's happening? Emma demanded, her face bright with curiosity. Thomas knelt down to the children's level, still grinning. How would you two feel about having a little brother or sister? Samuel's eyes went wide. A baby. A real baby. A real baby, Margaret confirmed, kneeling beside Thomas. Emma looked between them seriously. Will you still have time for us? Margaret reached out and pulled Emma close. Always, sweetheart. There will always be room in our hearts and our family for everyone we love. Emma's face broke into a brilliant smile. I'm going to teach the baby everything about being a Fletcher. The celebration that followed was joyous and heartfelt. Reverend Hayes offered a blessing for their growing family. The women surrounded. Margaret with advice and congratulations, and the men clapped Thomas on the back with hearty approval. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Margaret found herself face to face with Mrs. Dorothy Henley, who approached with something that might have been nervousness. "Mrs. Fletcher," the older woman began formally, "I wanted to congratulate you on your happy news." "Thank you, Mrs. Henley," Margaret replied graciously. Mrs. Henley cleared her throat. "I also wanted to say that I'm pleased to see how well you've settled in. The community is fortunate to have someone of your capabilities." It was as close to an apology as Dorothy Henley was likely to offer, and Margaret accepted it with the grace she'd learned over the past year. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." After the last guest had gone and the children were tucked into bed, Thomas and Margaret sat on their front porch, looking out over the farm that was now undeniably prosperous. The harvest had been their best in years, the debts were paid, and the future looked bright with possibility. "I should write to Ruth," Margaret said, thinking of her sister's last letter, which had grown increasingly puzzled about Margaret's continued silence. "What will you tell her?" Thomas asked. Margaret considered the question. A year ago, she would have struggled to explain her choice to stay. Now the words came easily. "I'll tell her that I've found exactly where I belong," she said, "that I'm married to a man who loves me completely, that I have children who call me Mama, and that we're expecting a baby in the spring. I'll tell her that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the greatest joy." Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing over the wedding ring that now felt as natural as breathing. "Any regrets, Mrs. Fletcher?" Margaret looked at the man who had transformed from a stranger offering desperate kindness into the love of her life, at the house that had become home, at the land that would soon welcome new life. "Only one," she said with a smile. "I regret that it took me so long to realize that home isn't a place you're born to. It's a place you choose, and that chooses you in return." As if summoned by her words, Samuel appeared in the doorway in his nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Mama, I can't sleep. Can you sing the lullaby?" Margaret rose and gathered him into her arms, this child who had been the first to call her Mama, who had shown her what it meant to be needed and loved without reservation. "Of course, sweet boy," she said, carrying him back toward the house. Thomas followed them inside, and together they climbed the stairs to tuck Samuel back into bed. As Margaret sang the gentle melody that had become their family's evening ritual, she thought about the woman who had sat crying on a trunk at the train station just 1 year ago. That woman had been abandoned, desperate, and certain she would never belong anywhere. This woman, Margaret Fletcher, was surrounded by love, secure in her place in the world, and looking forward to a future bright with promise. Sometimes Margaret reflected as she kissed Samuel goodnight and prepared for bed beside her beloved husband. The most impulsive decisions lead to the most perfect destinations. And sometimes being abandoned at a train station is exactly what you need to find your way home. Outside their window, the Nebraska sky stretched vast and star-filled over the farm where the Fletcher family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other everything they had ever been looking for and everything they would ever need. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.